You stand before the household shrine near the kitchen while the flame still burns low and the scent of fresh wine has only just touched the morning air. A small piece of bread is set down. A brief prayer is spoken. These gestures are so modest that they seem to belong only to the privacy of your own roof. Yet in Rome, it was precisely here that a day's life first entered its proper form. In the family lararium, the household gods were present not as some distant idea, but as an intimate part of the home, the meal, and the ordinary piece of daily life. Then, when you step out into the forum, the sacred appears again in another form. The sacred calendar marks which days are fit for legal business and which are reserved for ritual, so that even time itself bears an order that must be observed. And if you would like to continue following that thread, please subscribe to the channel and join me as we go deeper into the way the Romans brought belief, law, and daily life into a single enduring rhythm. From that household shrine, we can see more clearly how the Romans turned belief into habit. The Lares were not merely decorative figures. In Roman tradition, they were guardian deities tied to the family and to the continuity of domestic life. The Penates, by contrast, were associated with the household stores, with that sense of enough that kept the home standing through seasons and uncertainty. In many homes, these images were placed in the lararium, and offerings drawn from the family meal itself, wine, bread, honey, incense, made the table into a rite shaped by form and restraint. Morning prayers, offerings on family occasions, these repeated small gestures formed an inner discipline, to live in order so as to preserve well-being, harmony, and the household's way of life. In Rome, religion began with something very concrete, how a family started the day, and how it took its place at the table. When one stepped beyond the threshold, that faith did not dissolve into the crowd. It changed form and became the order of the neighborhood. The cult of the Lares originally had roots in boundary lines and the crossings between plots of land, and later entered urban life as guardian powers of crossroads and local communities. For that reason, a crossroads in the city of Rome was not merely a place of traffic and passing feet. It was also a meeting point of memory, local authority, and shared ritual. Under state organization, these neighborhood cults were restructured as well. The Britannica tradition notes that the genius of Augustus was attached to cult practice at the crossroads, allowing residents to feel the presence of central authority within the rhythm of ordinary local life. From this point on, religion did not merely preserve the order of the household. It also wove the neighborhood into a moral and political unit. From the neighborhood, we move into the place where Rome performed something especially subtle. It turned time into public discipline. The fasti were not simply lists of dates. They were sacred calendars indicating which days permitted legal proceedings. Once these calendars were displayed publicly in the forum, knowledge that had once been held by a small group became a common frame for the whole city. The meaning of this runs deep. People no longer lived in uncertainty about when public business could proceed and when it must stop before sacred limits. Time, therefore, ceased to be an invisible flow. It was inscribed in stone and calendars, in the rhythm of courts, assemblies, and rites. A city that learns to read the day by one shared rule gradually develops the habit of anticipation, and that power to anticipate is one of the foundations of order. Behind those calendars stood a less visible, but immensely important mechanism for keeping the rhythm, the priesthood that administered sacred law. Among Roman priestly colleges, the pontifeces held a particularly weighty position because they oversaw jus divinum, the body of law regulating relations between the community and the gods recognized by the state, while also supervising, in broad terms, the worship of families and lineages. From this vantage point, one can see a distinctly Roman quality. They did not allow religion to remain only in feeling or myth. They placed it within responsibility, authority, and procedure. A rite performed correctly was both an act of devotion and an act of compliance. When household, temple, and state all spoke the same language of ritual and law, belief became an invisible social infrastructure, quiet, but capable of keeping every rank moving in the same cadence. Yet Rome cared not only about performing the proper rite, it was also deeply cautious about the timing of action. Here, the role of the augur became crucial. Their task was to observe and interpret omens, signs understood as divine approval or disapproval of an intended undertaking. This reveals that in Roman life, a decision was not merely a matter of will or power, but also a matter of what was timely under a sacred gaze. The documentary tradition shows that divinatory consultation became an almost indispensable step before many public actions. Even in private life, consulting signs could be regarded as a serious matter. Thus, religion in Rome did more than teach people how to worship. It taught them restraint, patience, and the art of choosing the moment. If each household had a hearth as its center, then at the level of the community Rome also preserved a corresponding symbol, Vesta and her flame. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, associated with the home's stability and the things that sustained daily life. For that reason, she held an enduringly special place in Roman religion. The Vestal virgins tended the temple and the sacred fire of Vesta, and the unbroken presence of that flame carried a meaning beyond ritual itself. It symbolized the continuity of community. During Vestalia, the temple of Vesta was open to mothers who came to worship, an image deeply worth reflection, for the household hearth and the civic hearth were joined by the same sacred language. From the ordinary kitchen to the center of the city, Rome preserved order through symbols that were concrete, familiar, and repeated across generations. Yet a society cannot endure on strictness alone. Rome understood this. and Saturnalia shows how the Romans knew how to place relaxation itself within a ritual frame. It was one of the most beloved festivals of the year, beginning on December 17th and gradually extended over several days. During that time, work and business were suspended, many ordinary restraints were loosened, and those held in bondage were granted a rare freedom of speech. On the surface, it looked like an inversion of order. But looked at more closely, it reveals a remarkably subtle balance. The community was allowed release, yet only within a fixed span of time, under a known name, and through familiar rites. Precisely because it had limits, that freedom did not break society. It helped society recover. In Rome, even joy was organized. If Saturnalia opened a breathing space for the living, Paradalia reserved a quiet interval for the dead. This observance took place from midday on February 13th to February 21st, first as a sequence of family-centered rites commemorating deceased relatives, and then with a broader communal meaning. During those days, temples were closed and marriages were not celebrated. On the final day, the rite of Feralia was performed with offerings placed at tombs. This was not remembrance alone. It was Rome's way of placing memory within the public calendar, giving grief an official span of time, and turning filial devotion into a duty acknowledged by society at large. When the dead continued to be named through ritual, the family did not end with the present life. It continued as an order of names, obligations, and remembrance. Looking back across this entire thread, one sees that Roman religion did not stand outside daily life as a separate world of temples and monuments. It was present in the household hearth, at neighborhood crossroads, on calendar boards in the forum, in the council of priests, in caution before omens, in the flame of Vesta, in festivals where restraint was loosened, and in the season devoted to ancestral remembrance. The core of this system did not lie in sudden bursts of feeling, but in correct ritual, in an almost legal precision, and in the aim of preserving pax deorum, harmony with the gods, so that the community might remain at peace. That is why religion in Rome was both sacred and practical. It functioned as an art of organizing society, in which belief, calendar, law, and custom upheld one another. From here, the road opens onward. As the empire grew, how would that framework of order be tested? From that thread of order, a larger question emerges once Rome moved beyond the Italian peninsula. How could a religious framework formed around the household and the city-state endure within an empire of many peoples, each with its own gods and rites? What is striking is that Rome did not build stability by erasing difference. Britannica indicates that religious life in the provinces retained strong local vitality, while people were expected to respect the cults of neighboring communities. It was precisely this layering that gave the empire its distinctive character, recognizably Roman, yet not forcing every region to pray in the same voice. When belief became an art of coexistence, rule no longer rested only on armies or taxation. It also rested on the capacity to let many faiths exist within a single framework of order. Within that framework, the emperor's role was more symbolic than we often assume. In the provinces, the head of the empire was present not only through decrees and legions, he was also present through the way he performed ritual. Britannica emphasizes that when traveling through local regions, the emperor might offer sacrifice at important sanctuaries of each place while still maintaining conventional Roman piety. What was expected of the emperor was also expected of his subjects, a public respect for the different elements within the empire's religious whole. This was not abstract tolerance, but courtesy of power, a disciplined way of conducting oneself before the gods of others. In this way, Rome turned religious difference into part of the art of governance rather than a permanent source of instability. From that courtesy, Rome advanced a step further in subtlety. It used worship as a shared political language between local communities in the center. In the system of emperor worship, provincial priests did more than oversee ritual. At centers such as Lugdunum, they also met as city representatives, and on behalf of their communities they could present complaints or observations regarding the governor. Thus, the temple was not only a place of incense and offering, it was also an intermediary space where loyalty, urban honor, and local interests met beneath the symbol of imperial authority. Here we see a distinctly Roman trait. Religion was not separate from administration. It softened the surface of power, gave the provinces a ritualized way to speak to the empire, and clothed imperial rule in a legitimacy in which local communities themselves took part. Even within the city of Rome, that mechanism entered the neighborhood in a more familiar form. Britannica notes that in Italy, the official cult was directed toward the Genius Augusti, the protective spirit of the household of Augustus, and in Rome it was linked to the Lares Competales at crossroad shrines. The principal overseers, the Severi August Alesh, were often freedmen. This detail is highly significant. It shows that emperor worship was not only the affair of senators or high magistrates, it opened a sphere of honor for those who had been freed. When they tended neighborhood rites, they were at once serving sacred order and planting themselves within a new social order. At this level, religion became a bridge between political loyalty, aspirations to status, and the everyday rhythm of community life. From urban crossroads, we move into the military camp, where religion appears as collective discipline. Britannica notes that a 3rd century calendar found in an eastern city prescribed the rites that a garrison unit was to perform throughout the year, including many observances that were both very ancient and distinctly Roman. That detail alone is revealing. The empire did not allow soldiers merely to learn how to fight. It also placed them within a standardized rhythm of worship. In the same broader setting, many Western cities gave prominent scale to temples of Jupiter or the imperial family, often not because of direct command from above, but through local participation and enthusiasm. Religion thus created a quality of Romanness, felt through ritual calendars, temples, and ceremonies, a living identity more durable than slogans. This helps us understand why such a vast empire could still sustain the feeling of belonging to a common order. For a soldier on the frontier or a resident living far from Rome, attachment came not only from coinage or military insignia, but also from participating in a recognizable cycle of rites, days of remembrance, festivals for ancestral gods, and occasions honoring the imperial household. As those rhythms repeated over the years, Rome ceased to be merely a distant place name. It became a lived calendar. And because local religious life continued, people did not have to surrender their older identities in order to feel that they belonged to the empire. Rome succeeded in part because it knew how to lay a common rhythm over difference, strong enough to bind, broad enough to contain. Yet not every public decision could be left to a fixed calendar. There were moments when Rome needed to ask a different question. Did the gods approve this action or not? Here, augury entered as a component of state discipline. Britannica emphasizes that the constitutional function of the augur was not to predict the future, but to determine whether the gods favored a proposed course, especially in political and military affairs. This understanding is crucial. It turned the reading of signs into a procedure for legitimizing public decisions. Power therefore required not only reasons and force, it also required sacred assent, correctly interpreted through ritual. For the Romans, that caution gave action a layer of legitimacy the community could accept. Alongside the augur, the Roman world also knew another interpretive tradition, more distinctly marked by Etruscan influence, the haruspices. Britannica describes them as diviners who infer divine will from the entrails of sacrificial animals, especially the liver, and who also interpreted prodigies such as thunder and unusual phenomena, then proposed corresponding rites of expiation. Although this art did not become part of the official state religion in quite the same way as augury, its importance remained considerable in many periods. What deserves attention is not only the technique itself, but the social need it addressed. It turned anxiety before the abnormal into a process that could be handled. When disaster was translated into a sign, the community was less likely to panic. When the sign was answered with ritual, authority regained initiative in the face of uncertainty. If the rites just described show how the state confronted uncertainty, the cursed tablets at Bath let us hear the voice of ordinary people facing the small injustices of daily life. According to the Roman baths in UNESCO, around 130 tablets of lead or lead tin alloy, dating from the 2nd century to the late 4th century, were inscribed with private petitions and then thrown into the hot spring, where people believed the goddess Sulis Minerva dwelt. Many of these petitions arose from the theft of very ordinary belongings, but for those with few possessions, such losses could be severe. This is precisely what makes the material so valuable. Religion did not serve only emperors or grand festivals. It was also a place where common people could deposit anger, hurt, and hope for justice when formal law felt too distant. Looking more closely at these objects, we see a spiritual world that is highly concrete, almost tangible. UNESCO notes that some curses included magical symbols, some were written backward to increase effectiveness, and some were nailed or rolled up before being consigned to sacred waters. The British Museum also records lead tablets pierced with holes, rolled and hidden beneath floors, or inserted into wall niches as ways of strengthening a curse. These details should not be viewed with easy ridicule. They show Romans, especially common people, using material things to act upon the invisible: writing, metal, water, nails, place. In that light, the boundary between religion, magic, and appeals for justice in everyday life becomes far more fluid than modern categories often suggest. Alongside those private voices ran the rhythm of public festivals, marking the body of the city itself. Lupercalia is a clear example. Britannica notes that it was an annual festival held on February 15th, led by the priestly group known as the Luperci, and associated with purification and fertility. Its rites contain many ancient elements, even ones that later generations found difficult to understand. Yet that very antiquity reveals something important. Rome preserved within its urban life a very old layer of ritual memory, and allowed that memory to continue shaping how people felt about the seasons, the body, fertility, and fortune. When a community knows a festival day together, awaits it together, and retells it together, the city becomes more than a cluster of buildings. It becomes a shared emotional calendar. Yet Rome also demonstrated a consistent principle. Ritual was accepted only so long as it remained within the framework of public order. The story of the Bacchanalia is a sharp example. Britannica records that these rites entered Rome from southern Italy, at first in a more discreet form, then expanded into gatherings held with increasing frequency. By 186 BCE, their notorious reputation led the Senate to issue a decree banning them throughout Italy, except in certain special cases. The point here is not merely a moral reaction. It was the state's response to a form of gathering and ritual that it believed had moved beyond its power to supervise. Rome did not simply fear what was foreign. Rome feared any practice that blurred the line between devotion and the power to organize crowds. After such limits, we see another face of the empire, its ability to receive and rearrange foreign cults when they answered the spiritual needs of society. Among the Eastern mystery cults, Britannica notes that the cult of Isis was the most widespread. It had a place in Rome from the time of Augustus and spread across Italy in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Symbolically, Isis was associated with healing, miracles, and motherhood. In Egyptian tradition, she was also connected with rites for the dead. These qualities help explain her appeal in a vast urban world where people frequently faced illness and uncertainty. The presence of Isis did not erase traditional Roman religion. Rather, it shows that imperial religious life could expand like a house with many rooms. Another case that shows Rome's talent for Romanizing the foreign is the cult of the Great Mother, Magna Mater, that is Cybele. Britannica notes that by around 200 BCE, the Great Mother and Attis had been brought into the Roman pantheon. Later, this cult was more actively encouraged under Claudius. Yet at the same time, another Britannica source notes that in the earlier period Roman citizens had been forbidden to participate directly in Cybele's rites, a restriction lifted only under the empire. This combination of reception and regulation reveals Rome's logic. It could borrow symbolic strength from outside, but it still wanted to control the pace and form of that integration. For urban residents, the new did not appear as a rupture, but as an added layer, guarded by the state. Within this larger picture, Mithraism shows a different kind of appeal, more discreet, more selective, and rich in ritual structure. Britannica notes that Mithraea were often underground spaces or cave-like settings with small capacity. Many could hold no more than 100 people, and the rites took place in artificial light. Alongside this was a system of 7 grades of initiation, which gave the cult the character of a disciplined progression rather than a mass festival. Another Britannica source also emphasizes that the cult of Mithras excluded women. These features help explain its attraction in the empire, a selective community with shared symbols, hierarchy, and stages of advancement. In the crowded Roman city, such spaces offered participants a distinct inner order of their own. By this point, the most striking feature is no longer any single cult, but the operating principle of imperial religious life as a whole. Britannica describes how, in the 3rd century, local cults remained vigorous, while society at large maintained respect for the cults of neighbors. What was expected of the emperor was also expected of everyone else. The result was that Rome did not require absolute uniformity in order to create stability. It created stability through a code of conduct, knowing which altar was one's own, which altar belonged to another, and how to pass through difference without breaking it. This was a spiritual technique of empire, less dazzling than military victory, but no less important. It allowed many communities to live under one roof of power while still recognizing themselves in the mirror. Yet when the 4th century began, that balance started to shift. The rise of Christianity did not simply add one more cult to the empire's many-roomed house. It gradually reopened the question of truth and religious authority at the foundation. The year 313, commonly associated with the Edict of Milan, marks a decisive movement. Britannica notes that the declaration published in the East under the name of Licinius in June 313 granted everyone the right to worship whatever god they wished, secured legal rights for Christians, and required the restoration of confiscated property. This time, its effect truly established religious toleration. The great change, therefore, did not come through theology alone. It came through legal text, property rights, and formal recognition. But the change did not stop at toleration. Britannica shows that Constantine quickly moved beyond the agreement at Mediolanum. From 313 onward, he granted imperial property to the Bishop of Rome for church building, extended legal and fiscal privileges to clergy, and intervened in internal disputes within the church. In his letters and policies, he expressed the belief that religious division could offend God and harm the affairs of the empire. In the end, this way of thinking was not entirely alien to older Roman tradition. Power was still understood as needing a proper relationship with the sacred in order for the state to remain secure. The difference was that the central object had changed. From this point onward, imperial subjects gradually sensed a new reality. Religion was beginning to receive unequal support from the throne. By the time of Theodosius, that process entered a more forceful stage. Britannica notes that he was the first emperor not to assume the title Pontifex Maximus of the old cult. In 380, he issued an edict imposing a Christian creed as the standard for his subjects. Then in 391 forbade sacrifice and entry into temples, and by the end of 392 tightened matters further with a complete ban on the worship of pagan gods. Yet Britannica's account of church life in the empire also notes that around the year 400, the majority of the population was probably still not Christian, especially in rural and mountainous regions. This reminds us that Rome's religious transformation did not occur as a sudden turn of the wheel. Law may change quickly, custom changes slowly, and ritual memory can endure for a very long time. Seen as a whole, what emerges is not only a history of gods, but the history of a civilization that used belief to organize life. From the household hearth to neighborhood crossroads, from calendars in the forum to frontier camps, from provincial petitions voiced through the imperial cult to the lead-cursed tablet of someone robbed of a small possession, from the coexistence of many altars to the effort to unify belief under Christian emperors, every stage shows religion in Rome as an infrastructure of habit, time, power, and hope. That is why the stone ruins still speak to us about human life. They once supported gestures repeated every day. If you'd like to continue, please follow the channel so we may move together to the next thematic axis.